All right. Well, we've given it a couple minutes. I think we can probably get going. Welcome to the Water Availability Task Force meeting for February. I am Kat Weissmiller with the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and I don't have any specific announcements for today. I'm happy to open the floor if anyone else does have announcements they want to share. I think I saw that Tracy just. Okay, well, hearing no other announcements, we could probably just get going and kick it off with a report from the state climatologist. So I will stop sharing my screen and let's see, is it Russ or Peter that's going today?
I'll be going today.
Okay, great.
Let's see, are you seeing my screen?
Yeah, we can see it, Peter.
Awesome. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Peter. I work with the Colorado Climate Center at Colorado State, for those who might not know me, and I will be giving our normal briefing of current climatic conditions, some of the anomalies that we've seen over the last couple months, and what might be coming in the spring based on what we're seeing in seasonal outlooks. Looked like it was a bit of a thinner crowd this morning than usual, and that may be an impact report in and of itself, where I feel like this report is some of the best news I've given at a water availability task force meeting since 2019. So that's certainly great to see. All right, so the breakdown will be pretty standard. We'll go over some of our recent climate conditions, focusing mostly on temperature and precipitation. Then we'll take a look at where things stand with the US Drought Monitor and some of what goes into that with a short drought update. And then we'll do a quick look at the forecast, both short-term and the longer-term outlook for spring. It's hard to believe with how cold it's been in recent months that spring is just in front of us, but you know, I was outside last night at 6 o'clock and there was still a little dusk in the sky. The days are certainly getting longer, so things are going to change. All right, here is one of the quadrant charts that Russ likes to put together, showing temperature and precipitation conditions for the water year to date, so October through January, the first third of the water year, if you can believe it, and we've got another half a month plus under our belt from there. So here, each year shows a point in our historical distribution of both precipitation October through January on the x-axis and average temperature on the y-axis. The crosshatches that you see show the 1991 through 2020 normals for October through January. So a normal by recent standards would be right where the crosshairs meet. 2023 is well within the cool and wet quadrant of the chart. So this is the coolest start we've had to a water year since 2010. So over 10 years since we've had a first third of the water year this cold. And then it's the wettest start we've had to a water year statewide since 2016, where we started in the warm and wet quadrant. I had to go back and look at that because 2016 doesn't necessarily stand out in my memory as a particularly wet year. The water year as a whole leaned wet, but didn't stay particularly wet. We got some good rains early in November, which is unusual, and then some decent early to mid-season snowpack. But you can see that we're running fairly close to 2019, which of course was a good year, but we're by no means guaranteed the kind of spring that we had in 2019 that made it a really good water year. All right, here's a look at how temperatures ranked for the month of January. You can see the cool anomalies in Northeast Colorado, and then some warm anomalies speckled throughout the West Slopes and the San Luis Valley. it's worth stressing every time I show these that these are anomalies with respect to the 20th century average, or 1901 through 2000. So, you know, the 20th century average is cooler than average conditions today. And if we were just looking at this with respect to our most recent normals, or 1991 through 2020, we would definitely see that January was cooler than our recent normals across most of the state. And we can see a similar pattern for the water year to date. Again, this is October through January, with cool anomalies, even with respect to the 20th century over much of Northeast Colorado. And these cool anomalies would stand out much more prominently if we were looking at things with respect to our most recent climate normals. I've talked to a few farmers in Northeast Colorado over the last month or two that have said, oh, this is like one of our old winters. And, you know, the data supports those anecdotes where we're seeing conditions that are definitely cool by recent standards for winter, but may align more nicely with some of the old school averages. So this is just something I wanted to bring up. First, I'm going to go back to highlight the relative warm anomaly over parts of the San Luis Valley and the cool anomaly over the Northeast Plains. A lot of this goes back to what's happening with snow cover. If you have a persistent snow cover on the ground, that makes it so more sunlight is reflected during the day, keeping your daytime highs cooler, and you emit infrared radiation out to space more efficiently at night, meaning the nighttime lows are cooler as well. If we look at our current snow cover, we see that the San Luis Valley has failed to put down a persistent snow cover this winter. And don't get me wrong, being in the valley between two high mountain regions, the area has still seen some bitter cold nights, but it doesn't get as cold without the fresh snow on the ground in the valley. Conversely, much of the eastern plains of Colorado have seen persistent snow cover since those couple days before Christmas, or in some cases even earlier than that. And that's not always the case. So we have seen that help to generate some of the cold anomalies that we've seen over the last couple months, as well as just anomalies in weather patterns, where we've had a number of cold fronts with some teeth really dropping out of the northwest. All right, here's a look at temperatures for the month to date. As you can see, across most of the state, we're showing cool colors, indicating that we have continued our cold streak for the last few months. There are parts of the Front Range and Urban Corridor that, when you add in the last couple days, which have been a little bit warmer than normal, might even lean just a little bit above that normal mark. And again, this is with respect to the recent 1991 through 2020 normals. Sorry to mix periods on you like that, but we can see that things have been cool with respect to recent years. Like I said, pretty close to normal on the Front Range Urban Corridor. However, we've got another cold front dropping in tonight that will bring those averages down a little bit across much of the state. We'll see how much in the next couple days. All right, we'll talk about that a little bit more at the beginning of the outlook. For now, let's shift gears a bit to precipitation over the last couple months and the start of the water year. January was a wet month for most of the state. Again, this is with respect to the 1901 through 2000 averages. That doesn't make as much of a difference with precipitation as it does with temperature, because with precipitation, if we look at those long-term records, for the most part, we don't see the same long-term trends, just a whole lot of interannual variability. If you isolate some seasons in particular times of the year, you might see more of a trend, but these are, I believe, fairly consistent with recent normals as well. There are parts of the Northeast Plains that have had over 700% of normal precipitation in January. That's a really exciting number, but then you have to keep in mind the context that January is part of the dry season for the Eastern Plains. So as good as this snowpack and some of the recent precipitation has been, when you consider that the Eastern Plains are dealing with long-term drought still, and that this is part of the dry season, this area will still need the $1 million rains come April and May. So that's definitely something that I'm going to harp on more when it comes time to talk about the outlook, because as good as things have been recently for the Eastern Plains, we are still going to need to see the moisture continue as we get into the spring, because this can easily be undone by several weeks of warm and dry conditions in time periods like May and June. The wet anomalies out west are of course good to see. They're not as extreme over some of the high elevation areas, which is too bad because we want to see that snowpack really build up this time of year. In general, snowpack has built above median levels throughout the month of January, on top of what was already a pretty good snowpack going into January. So you're going to hear more about that from NRCS in just a little bit, but overall a nice wet month in January. This is a map just showing percent of normal moisture over the last 30 days. So to include the first 2/3 of February. And actually, it's been a dry start to February for the most part across much of northern Colorado, but it's been better across much of southern Colorado. Although again, these numbers that we see in parts of the low elevations of the Arkansas Basin, recent conditions, yes, have been good with the moisture that they received last week. That said, we have some longer term drought conditions, and this is part of the dry season. So you still need the $1 million rains come springtime. As far as some of the dry conditions over the mountains are concerned, what we're seeing right now is helping to undo some of that. And then we do have some wet conditions in the forecast. So February may not end as a particularly dry month for the mountains, which of course is good news as we continue to build our winter snowpack. I've talked about this a fair bit already. When we're looking at February, this is part of the dry season for the Eastern Plains and part of the wet season for the high elevations of Western Colorado. This is not a map of precipitation. This is just a map showing the relative contribution of February precipitation in an average year to the precipitation you get throughout the whole calendar year. So if the area is shaded in white, that means that February on average is neither part of the wet nor dry season. It's kind of an average month. If it's shaded in this blue green, it's an important month because it's part of the wet season. And then if it's in brown, it's still part of the dry season. So that's why some of these percents of normal that we have seen in January and in Northeast Colorado and parts of Southeast Colorado in February stand out so much. Okay, here's a look at how precipitation ranks over the last 12 months. So looking more long-term through the end of January, you see a lot of either normal or relatively wet conditions across Western Colorado. Not only have we had a good start to our cold season, a lot of these areas had a pretty good monsoon season. So overall, you see a lot of near normal or near average and wetter than average conditions. And then if you look at the Eastern Plains, you still see, in spite of some of what we've seen recently, there is long-term drought here yet to be undone. All right, just a quick look at some of our statewide extremes for the month of January. The main thing I wanted to bring this up for is to point out this minus 44 degrees Fahrenheit that we measured in Maybell on January 31st. Some of you who are more of Colorado weather historians might recognize this location as the location that produced our statewide record of minus 61 Fahrenheit in February of 1985, when we have a fresh snow cover and the winds get calm after a big cold front in that Yampa River Valley. Things can get quite cool indeed. This is the coldest that we've seen at Maybell in over 10 years. We have seen, if we're looking statewide, extremes to match or even beat this in recent years at Antero Reservoir, which is another one of our usual suspects for cold extremes. Okay, now I'm going to take a quick look at some of our indicator stations around the state of Colorado, how we're doing for the water year so far, and where things could go from here. These regions were defined in a study by Klaus Wolter to look at which parts of Colorado were most climatically consistent with one another. Russ has actually done an update on this kind of analysis with more recent data, but perhaps that's a story for another time. For now, let's look at some of our water year conditions from some of our indicator sites. I'm going to run through a number of these, starting with Grand Lake and working around the state counterclockwise. When you're looking at these graphics, keep in mind the black line shows the accumulation for the water year to date. The dark stippled line shows what we see in a normal water year. And again, when I say normal, I'm talking 1991 through 2020 in this case. The green stippled line shows what we would get in a normal year if it's normal from this point on out. And then the red and blue lines show above and below normal projections, or they are 75th on the wet side and 25th on the dry side percentile projections for precipitation. And then this whole mess of grayed outlines you see are accumulations that we have seen in previous years from this point in the water year forward. So you see the spread of the outcomes that can occur. And of course, new extremes are always possible. So if anything, this is even an underrepresentation of the spread that we could potentially see. Before I move on, just pointing out Grand Lake, pretty dry for February to date, although that's changing here in the last day or two and going through the next week. So we'll see what happens. Like I said, much of northern Colorado has been pretty dry throughout the month of February, but pretty close to average for the water year to date, and things can really go any which way from this point. Steamboat Springs had a really nice end to December and start to January, as did much of western Colorado. And you can see that we're well above normal to this point, but still a lot of water year left to go, of course. One thing that I think is important to point out as we're thinking about the build in snowpack and how that might translate to runoff is that what happens in terms of precipitation from the beginning of October really through the end of May, not just when snowpack peaks, and particularly not just April 1. What happens from October through May is important for runoff. And if we look from this point forward to the end of May, there are a number of traces that go below the normal line. So an above normal runoff year is not locked in yet, but it is certainly favored for a lot of these basins across western Colorado, given the accumulation that we've seen so far. Again, you'll get more of that from NRCS. Here's a look at Grand Junction, which is similar to Steamboat in that end of December, beginning of January was good. And we've seen above normal conditions, well above normal for the water year to date. You're going to see a lot of that across the west slopes. Montrose, similar story. And then Mesa Verde, a really nice boost in the middle of January. Although it's been dry since, we're still sitting above normal for the water year to date at 132% of normal. All right, as we go into the San Luis Valley, the Rio Grande Basin and the Arkansas Basin are where we've seen some of our driest conditions for the water year to date. And in some of those locations, that's sitting on top of longer term drought as well. Alamosa, we're seeing below normal conditions for the water year to date. But if you look at the San Luis Valley in the low elevation, it's really the summer season where things get cranking in a normal year. So things could still definitely go any which way here. Colorado Springs, we're right on average for this point, but again, this is a location that gets most of its precipitation in late spring and summer. So you see normal projection lining up with just what is normal for the water year. And then again, things could go any which way from here. And then Walsh, I believe this was, Walsh is the 6th driest water year to date to this point. So definitely well behind, but Walsh is another area where the spring and summer matter more than the winter, so what happens going forward is going to be very important. And then Akron, we've seen some of the wetter side of things with the cooler temperatures and above average snowfall across Northeast Colorado in recent months. You can see that 25th percentile projection lines up right about with the normal water year. So there's about a 75% probability of an above normal water year, just based on what we've locked in so far, to say nothing of what the outlook may or may not be. And then Boulder, again, we're right on normal so far. One thing that I think is interesting about Boulder is that the average projection from here on out is pretty close to the 75th percentile projection. That's not a mistake. That just means that this is a site with a fairly skewed precipitation distribution. So the median is less than the mean. And to some extent, you can thank 2013 for that, where you see this this trace from 2013 always, I have a hard time not mentioning it because of how much it stands out. All right, so now I'm going to move into a brief drought conditions update using some of the context that we've built with the previous slides, and then we'll get into the outlook for the next couple weeks and into the spring season. All right, I mentioned that overall this is better news than we've seen in a while, particularly for Western Colorado, where recent precipitation and snowpack have been good, but you still see quite a bit of drought on the U.S. Drought Monitor on the Eastern Plains, and that makes sense given that things you can only expect to improve so much during the dry season, and that we went into this water year with dry conditions, particularly in Northeast Colorado. In fact, this is kind of a mix of where Northeast Colorado conditions were really bad going into the water year and haven't improved. Southeast Colorado conditions were so-so going into the water year, and if anything, have even degraded a little bit. But this is the current U.S. Drought Monitor depiction, and this is how it's changed over the last 3 months, where you can see what I've mentioned. A lot of the northern portion of the state has seen improvements. Parts of the southern portion of the state, particularly focused in the Arkansas Basin and around areas like the Sangre de Cristos, where we've seen below normal snowpack and below normal water year-to-date precipitation, things have degraded on the U.S. Drought Monitor. If we look at the last year, this is where some of the good news comes in too, is that in terms of longer term drought, definitely some major improvements in Western Colorado and Central Colorado. We're looking better this time of year in 2023 than we were this time of year in 2022. Here's a look at soil moisture percentiles across the state. Keep in mind that we did see a decent storm in Southeast Colorado last week that is not quite yet reflected in these graphics because there's about a week latency in this data set. We see above normal soil moisture conditions across quite a bit of Western Colorado, which is great to see. That's not what we've seen during the cold season in a lot of recent years. And over a lot of our high elevation areas, we locked in some of the wettest antecedent soil moisture conditions that we've seen since 2014, which is of course great to see, given the buzz in recent years about low antecedent soil moisture conditions leading to below normal runoff. That said, this is just the top meter, and I think you've got to look quite a bit deeper than the top meter when you're making connections to runoff and surface hydrology like that. But if you look at Eastern Colorado, still quite a bit of below normal soil moisture. Again, there's the caveat that we don't have the most recent storm. And there's the additional caveat that you saw that much of the Northeast Plains is currently snow covered, and a lot of that has yet to melt and sink into the soils. So we'll see how that changes things when things finally melt. All right, now we're going to move into the seasonal outlook. I'm starting by just showing another one of those proportion maps for the month of March, since we'll spend a fair bit of time looking at March. like March is still definitely part of the cold season if in terms of precipitation patterns, where it's wetter than the average month across much of the high elevations and drier across much of the low elevations. However, March is where we really start to see things change, where it's kind of the shoulder of the dry season for the Eastern Plains, where precipitation rates really start to pick up, particularly towards the end of the month. And then when we're considering the outlook for months like April and May, those months are still very important for Western Colorado and high elevation, and they're game on for the Eastern Plains. So March, April, May, certainly a crucial season for the state of Colorado. All right, we'll start with just the short term. And this is starting when I put these slides together yesterday. So I didn't update this morning. I'm sorry about that. Some of this precipitation in the mountains has already materialized over the last day, but this is looking at whether we'll see above or below normal precipitation over the next 7 days from NOAA's Weather Prediction Center. And above normal moisture week is on tap for much of the west slopes, which should help with our keep our snowpack numbers looking robust. Again, this storm looks likely to miss the Sangre de Cristos and the Arc Basin, so continuing with the pattern that we've seen, kind of a rich get richer, poor get poorer pattern. And then this moisture will spill over the Continental Divide. Starting tonight, you'll definitely see those temperatures get knocked way down as the front hits us on the east side of the divide after sundown, with the snow settling in after the front comes through over the nighttime hours. This front, again, it doesn't look like it's going to dive all the way out onto the southeast plains. It looks like it'll kind of stop at the Palmer Divide. This front has some really cold air behind it, but it's interesting in the sense that this air mass, again, it's not diving real far south and it's moving fairly quickly. So if we do get some really cold air in behind it, it'll come and go quite quickly. Russ told me I could make a bold prediction on what low temperatures we'll see tomorrow night. It looks like the way this front's kind of hitting, the Weather Service right now has a low on Wednesday night for Fort Collins of -10, but 0 for Denver. So you don't usually see that much of a gradient between the two. It depends in part on how much fresh snow cover gets put down. For my bold prediction, I'm going to go with a little bit of a disappointment. I'm going to say -4 for Fort Collins, +2 for Denver. We'll see what happens. All right, it looks like some of the colder weather could stick around over the 8 to 14 day time frame, with some of those longer term weather models keeping cold air systems dropping in over the western portion of the country, with a lot more snow likely for the Sierra Nevadas. So that's going to continue with some of the impressive snowpack numbers that we've seen out west from our state. Colorado's in a bit more of a gradient zone where things are looking pretty good for cooler weather conditions to prevail for the west slopes at the tail end of February and first week of March. So we may see snowpack numbers continue to look good. Things are much less certain when you look east of the Continental Divide, whether any of these systems will make it east of the Continental Divide, or whether we'll have blocking high pressure over the south central portion of the country, kind of forcing those storms to be ejected further to the north when they track across the state. So a lot of uncertainty in your 8 to 14 day time scale when you're looking at eastern Colorado, but likely a continuation of the cool and wet conditions that we've seen for western Colorado. Now, when we move beyond 14 days, our atmospheric models really descend into chaos. So we have to look at the statistical linkages between slower moving indicators like sea surface temperature patterns that can set up certain weather patterns, and things like land surface patterns like persistent snow cover or like dry soil can affect temperature and precipitation on more monthly or seasonal time scales. When we're looking at springtime, we're definitely still concerned with what's going on over the equatorial Pacific and what's going on with El Nino, La Nina, as that can drive different types of weather patterns setting up over the state of Colorado in the winter and spring. We're in our third year of La Nina in 2023. However, you can see that it's fizzling right now from the current sea surface temperature pattern, and it is projected to die out over the course of the spring. You can see we don't have that cold tongue of sea surface temperatures across the equatorial Pacific just off the west coast of South America like you do in a classic La Nina setup, but you still see the influence of the La Nina as it's dying out over the central equatorial Pacific. You still see a colder than normal California current and colder than normal sea surface temperatures across much of the Pacific, just southeast of Hawaii. And that still is definitely influencing the seasonal outlook. When we look at some of the predictions from the NOAA's Climate Prediction Center, they're still fairly consistent with La Nina conditions, even as La Nina is dying out currently. I will say that this is a fairly favorable time of year for La Nina to die out for Colorado. And I think I'll come back to the slide that I just skipped. This slide shows why that is. So this is showing using precipitation from years 1951 through 2020. What's the correlation between the El Nino Southern Oscillation Index and precipitation rates in Colorado by season? So looking at December, January, February, or winter in the upper left, spring upper right, summer lower left, and fall lower right. Areas that are red are typically wetter during El Nino, and areas that are blue are typically wetter during La Nina. So we get more favorable conditions oftentimes for the Northern Rockies over winter during La Nina, but then the whole state tends to go wetter during El Nino in March, April, May, or during spring. So if you could set it up perfectly, you would want La Nina to fizzle kind of right at the end of meteorological winter, and maybe even build in a quick El Nino signal over springtime. I think we're going to have more neutral conditions over much of the spring, and like I was showing in the sea surface temperature slide, even as more neutral conditions build, we may hold some of the influence of La Nina over the coming month or two anyway. It's looking likely that by the time we get into February, March, April, La Nina is projected to die and neutral conditions are likely to dominate over much of the spring. And then if you look forward to the meteorological summer and fall, right now, ocean surface models are showing a decent shot, as much of a 60% shot of an El Nino developing by fall. So that's something that we'll have to stay tuned to in future outlooks. Here is the Climate Prediction Center's outlook for the month of March. And you can see this is still a fairly typical La Nina pattern with the below normal temperatures to the north and above normal temperatures to the south. And then above normal precipitation over the Ohio River Valley and to the west of that, and below normal kind of over the southern, more Gulf of Mexico states. These outlooks were made in mid-February. They are 5 days old. And right now, looking at how things are shaping up for the beginning of March, I've put this arrow towards cooler than normal temperatures for Western Colorado, because I think if these maps were to be redone today based on just what we're seeing in the forecast models going forward, you might see an elevated probability of below normal temperatures for the month of March, at least on the west slopes. East of the divide, like I was mentioning, there's more uncertainty, but I think you could at least put a slight tilt here. With precipitation, I was at least tempted to put a green arrow facing up over northwest Colorado over the month of March, based on what we're seeing going into the first week of March. But since precipitation is so highly variable and there's a lot of the month to go, I left it equal chances or equally clueless. We'll see what happens throughout the month of March. Here's the Climate Prediction Center's March through May outlook. And again, you still see quite a bit of the influence of La Nina, where the above and below normal temperature and precipitation patterns are setting up. But you do see some things changing. For instance, we start to see more elevated probabilities of above normal temperatures, particularly as we get into May, and then even more so as we get into May, June. We are seeing more consistency in recent years with our summers being warmer than the normals. And that's even true in the tail end of spring. So I don't think I put in the April, May, June outlooks, but you see that as we get into meteorological summer, these increased odds of above normal temperatures start to ramp up over Colorado and much of the Western US. This below normal precipitation bubble that shows up across the four corners and influences much of the state, that's not just based on still seeing some influence from La Nina, where we do tend to see La Nina springs don't give us as good a probability of a nice wet spring. That's also the fact that in the Southwest US, springs have trended drier in recent years, and that includes parts of Southwest Colorado. We'll see what happens there. The amount of elevated probability of below normal precip that the Climate Prediction Center has put into our state over the spring, I think if anything may overdo it a little bit. I might be tempted to put more of the northern half of the state more cemented in that equally clueless or equal chances category. So at least giving you kind of a shrug for the seasonal outlook, it's good that we have some above normal snowpack in the bank. Let's see, I did throw on the April, May, June, and you do see the elevated probabilities of above normal temperatures rising as we get into the summer season. Okay, just a couple more slides that are mostly good news to throw in before we move on. This is a percent of median peak snow water equivalent slide. So it's not a percent of median based on where we are right now. And I just wanted to show this as a little bit of good news to show as a teaser for the next presentation that we have some areas of the state where we're already near our water year median peak a month early. So it's great, again, with the seasonal forecast being a bit of a shrug to have extra water in the bank already. And then no elevated probability of a significant wildfire potential for April. I threw this on specifically because in recent years, we have seen elevated probabilities over eastern Colorado, where when conditions are dry and windy in the spring before the vegetation greens up, you can have some pretty disastrous brush fires. So right now, based on some of the weather conditions we've seen recently, we don't see the elevated potential of significant wildfire early in the spring. That's of course great to see as well. So some key takeaways before I turn it over to NRCS or take any questions. We've tallied the coolest 4-month start to the water year since 2010 and the wettest since 2016. So again, this is some of the best news I've given at a WATF briefing since spring 2019 when things looked quite good. February is on the cool side of normal again. For some areas, that's the 4th month in a row. San Juans are having a pretty good month for snowpack, although the northern part of the state has languished a bit in February up until this last week and going into the coming week. That certainly may change as we are seeing some wetter conditions are on the horizon in the short term. Long-term conditions still on the dry side of normal for eastern Colorado, despite what we've seen in northeast Colorado. So we'll still be holding out for those $1 million rains once we hit April, May, June. And the let's see, the next 4 to 6 weeks, really the next 2 to 3 months will be crucial for what happens with our water supply going forward. And then La Nina is letting go. Neutral conditions are likely to dominate in the equatorial Pacific over spring. Overall, we're still seeing some La Nina influence on the outlook over the next month, maybe two, but particularly as we get into April, May, things are fairly uncertain, especially when it comes to precipitation. And then as we get into the summer season, based on trend and climate change, we do see an elevated probability of above normal temperatures going into the summer season. So the cool weather that we're experiencing now, not necessarily a great indicator of the future, particularly once we get into summer. And then overall, precipitation snowpack looking the best it has since 2019. Overall, I'm fairly optimistic about the situation going into spring, but I will turn it over to an NRCS to say more about that. Do we have any questions before I stop screen sharing and hand things over? Perfect. Well, I will turn things over, and thanks so much for listening to my briefing.
Thanks, Peter.
All right. And can you guys see my screen there?
Yep, but it's not in presentation mode yet.
Okay. All right. As usual, thank you, Peter. And yeah, thanks for that little kickoff there at the end. As we, this time of year in particular, that percent of median peak is always an interesting metric to keep in mind. And also just throw in a general plug with relation to that. In addition to our standard percent of median, the percent of normal, as we call it, that we commonly present on, that interactive map that Peter displayed also does have tons and tons of other different interesting metrics to look at. That percent of median peak, percentile rankings, record highs, record lows. You can compare to different portions of the period of record. So yeah, just a quick plug for folks who are really interested in digging into different ways to look at the snowpack and what that means for them. There's definitely a lot more to explore beyond just the percent of normal in that. But yeah, with that, I will go ahead and dive on into look at the Yampa White Little Snake combined basins, currently at 134% of normal snowpack. Some variability within that. You can see Dry Lake here just outside of Steamboat at 161% of normal is on the high end, but really across all these combined basins, pretty consistently above normal snowpack conditions. Which is not necessarily going to be the case for all of our basins, as we will see here in a little bit. Looking at our time series graph here, really remained above normal throughout the entire water year, with starting right around Christmas, pretty major consistent increases that has put us at the 134% of the median here, and that is up into the 90th percentile. And as Peter noted, if you kind of just look across this 20 inches of SWE line, that puts these basins at what would be the normal peak snowpack, still with another month and a half or so to come of that normal accumulation season. With respect to water year to date precipitation, also well above normal, as would be anticipated. Currently at 124% of the median, a bit less than snowpack. You can kind of see, and we'll see this in a lot of basins, a lot of these water year precipitation numbers are lower due to a drier, primarily October that we experienced last year. Over in the Laramie and North Platte, this is a lot of A lot of this water is leaving the state pretty quickly, but still worth taking a look at. Currently 121% of normal snowpack and 114% of normal water year precipitation, both with pretty similar temporal patterns as its neighbors to the west that we just looked at. Taking a look at reservoir storage, not a ton volumetrically in the Yampa, but not sitting too bad, particularly compared to some of our basins in Southwest Colorado. Certainly below normal storage volumes, but a couple of these are pretty close. Stagecoach and Elkhead are up above 90% of their normal storages for this time of year. And then Yamcolo at about 80%. Taking a look at our actual volumetric streamflow forecasts. Imagine a lot of folks are pretty familiar with these plots by now, but I'll just give kind of a quick overview because we'll be looking at them with all of our major basins. So these colored bars here with the numbers are them is our range of exceedance probabilities for the given forecast. So commonly we'll report on this 50% chance of exceedance number in the green here with the bar in the middle. Then our 90% chance of exceedance is going to be a lower volume, but with a higher probability of achieving that. And then our 10% chance on this side. Then vertically here, this light gray bar is the 100% of normal. So this kind of gives just a general range of possible outcomes with respect to normal volume. So we can see here in the combined Yampa, White, and North Platte basins, really very, very low probability that we would be observing lower than normal streamflow volumes for this coming spring and summer season, which is encouraging to see from a water supply standpoint. And any rafters out there who were lucky enough to pull a Yampa permit, good news there for some big water. Here looking how those are distributed, very consistently high, particularly the Little Snake coming in again from a water supply standpoint in Colorado. This water is kind of coming in and leaving the state pretty quickly, but 200% of normal, really, really high volumes before it confluences with the Yampa. Another major outlet, Yampa at Maybell, 162%. Then the White at Meeker at 149%. So definitely forecasting by far the most plentiful volumes in the Yampa and White. And also just another reminder on these forecasts, these are all developed from February 1st data, so a bit old. And as Peter touched on, and I'll touch on here in this presentation as well, January definitely brought less precipitation across the state or what did I just say there? February brought less precipitation than January, and a lot of that was definitely preferential towards the southern mountains. So we could expect to see some of this change coming up for our March 1st forecasts. Going into the upper Colorado River Basin, basin-wide currently 120% of normal. Again, not a dramatic amount of variation spatially. Certainly the Grand Mesa area is doing pretty good this year. Park Reservoir, 170% of normal. Some variation there. Some lower numbers as we kind of get over towards the Front Range, a bit higher in the northern Front Range, but not as dramatic of a spatial differentiation in the snowpack as we see in some of the other basins. Going into our time series, again, currently 120% of normal snowpack, very dry October, but then the Colorado headwaters have seen pretty consistent snow accumulation starting in late October there, which is again been very, very good to see and leading to a much more encouraging outlook than we've seen for the last several winters. Water year precip currently 111% of normal. Going into reservoir storage, largely below normal storages. Again, these charts don't show all of the major reservoirs in the Colorado headwaters, kind of a smattering of some of the major ones. But you can see Green Mountain and Lake Granby both have above normal storages right now. Dillon Reservoir, probably about 90% of normal, maybe slightly above. Bit of a smattering, but not sitting relatively near normal, below, but again, more substantially more volumes relative to that normal value compared to some of our Southwest basins. Going to our time series of reservoir storage, going back to 1990, you can see here fairly near normal values basin wide. Definitely didn't see quite as big of a hit with some of the drier years post 2019, which was very wet, and has actually been able to kind of climb back up to those normal values over the last year and a half or so. Going into the stream flow forecasts, clearly not quite as plentiful as in the Yampa White, but surrounding normal. Generally, our 50% chance of exceedance volumes are generally above normal. One of our higher ones here, which is also going to be a challenging one to forecast, the Willow Creek, below Willow Creek Reservoir. For anyone invested in this region, keep in mind that East Troublesome Fire. Really, we have seen a significant impact on some of the snowmelt hydrology up there. Last year, it observed significantly higher stream flow runoff than anything else in the area relative to the snowpack. The year prior, the first year after the fire, this was not so much the case. So definitely a challenging forecast given that East Troublesome Fire up on Willow Creek. But based on the snowpack and precipitation, definitely looking plentiful. Also for folks on the emergency management side of things, I'm sure you're well aware, and in the burn areas, both melt rate and other things, including infiltration, can affect the timing of stream flow runoff for potential flood events. Some of our major, we'll just start at kind of our main outlet, Colorado at Cameo here, forecasted for 112% of normal seasonal volumes. Some of the more plentiful ones, again, higher up in the main stem headwaters. Got Wolford Mountain over here. Here's Willow Creek, Granby, all looking pretty good. As well as the Roaring Fork at 116% of normal. With Dillon being on the low end for this basin, but still forecast at near normal stream flow volumes. Moving over to the east into the South Platte, definitely one of the basins, along with the Rio Grande and Arkansas, where we're seeing quite a bit of spatial variability in snowpack and the subsequent forecasts. Kind of see much more plentiful snowpack across the mountains of the Northern Front Range, then getting kind of progressively lower west of Denver there, with a pretty big shift in a lot of these stations surrounding the main stem of the South Platte, around the South Park area, with much less snowpack there. And we do also see that reflected in the forecasts. Looking at the time series here, definitely haven't had the dramatic increases as we've seen in a lot of our Western Slope basins since the beginning of the year, currently at that 104% of normal snowpack across the whole basin. Water year-to-date precip, again, very similar ratio of our snowpack to the precipitation. Currently, it's at 95% of normal water year precip. Again, that lower number largely due to dry conditions throughout the first month of the water year. Reservoir storage, Definitely quite a few more of these major reservoirs in the South Platte holding above to well above normal storages for this time of year compared to some other basins. Certainly some outliers on the low end, but naturally for individual water users, you'll be wanting to look up kind of the individual reservoirs that are going to affect you, probably more so than these basin-wide averages that we do commonly report on. Going into our time series back to 1990, really since kind of the dry period around 2012, the South Platte has maintained near-ish normal values, plus or minus. You can see the 2002, the potential of how low it can get. And also definitely has fared quite a bit better than many basins on the western slope after that big increase in 2019, which we can see here. And then even the next year was able to refill to well above normal values, which was not the case in other regions. Going into our stream flow forecasts, I've got 2 slides on this, and you'll see a pretty dramatic shift. Again, take note of this vertical gray line here, which is the normal value. So you can see definitely in these main stem South Platte headwaters forecasts are for much lower volumes. We're looking at only a 30% or less, maybe even say a 20% chance of exceedance hitting those normal stream flow volumes as of now. Oops. Here, and I'll just flip back and forth so you can see really that stark difference in these main stem headwaters, and then you can tell relative to this normal line, a lot of carries coming out of the more of the northern front range, looking at having much more plentiful stream flow outlooks here. And then even the further north you move, moving up that scale a bit with the Big Thompson and the Poudre having the highest forecasts in the range of about 120% of normal volumes. Going to the map, again, these are displaying our 50% chance of exceedance, but gives you another view of that spatial distribution. All of these main stem forecasts emanating from the general South Park area and downstream, quite a bit lower, 70 to 75% pretty much. Antero looks like it could be a bit lower than that. And then a pretty big shift as we kind of generally trend into more of these northerly tributaries. And jumping back over to the western slope into the Gunnison River Basin. The Gunnison currently has the most plentiful snowpack in the state with respect to normal at 141% of the median. Definitely have seen some of the bigger increases over the last month and a half to that snowpack across southwest Colorado in particular, including the Gunnison. Relatively consistent, you know, as we move a bit further east, some lower values there. Of note here, our only site up on the Uncompahgre Plateau is looking very good up on Columbine Pass at 233%. I didn't check recently. I think sometime maybe mid last week that was at a record high, or excuse me, very near record high snowpack up on that one lonesome site on the Uncompahgre Plateau, which certainly could be of note for folks using that water. So looking at our time series, throughout the first half of the water year to date, above but near normal conditions. And then again, shortly before the new year, the faucet really turned on. We see pretty consistent increases up to where we sit now. And similar to the Yampa, take a look at this percent of median peak is at 86% now. Which I think you can see some of these blips in the data, which I'll actually have to make a note and have some of our staff review some of that data. I doubt this final little drop off here is completely accurate, but yeah, a month and a half or so before our normal peak, but getting very close to those values. Water year-to-date precip, bit lower, 127% of normal, kind of similar story there, being a bit lower than snow with a drier than normal early season potentially. So going into our reservoirs, the Gunnison and our combined Southwest basins, which are up next, have by far the lowest reservoir storage currently with respect to normal. They're both, I believe, at 67% of median storage. So a lot of these, where's our Blue Mesa here, biggest reservoir in the state, little above 60% there. The other ones in that Aspinall unit, Morrow Point and Crystal, doing a bit better. But yeah, definitely low storage values. And as I'm sure most folks are also aware, you know, we have seen the storages in Lake Powell have a pretty substantial impact on managing some upstream reservoirs as well. So that is probably going to be a long-term trend. I believe Lake Powell has reached another new low as of quite recently. So a lot of these storages in the Gunnison, but also really the greater upper Colorado are worth keeping a close eye on going forward, really for probably years to come at this point. Going into our time series here, we can see the big increase from that substantial snowpack in 2019. And then pretty much has had a really hard time over the subsequent 3 years getting too much of an increase from the primary snowmelt runoff season, leaving us down here, you know, in range of some of the lower values we've seen over the last 30 or so years. Looking at our stream flow forecasts, definitely great news for the Gunnison, as well as much of Southwest Colorado, given that fairly meager stream flows over the last several years have led to the fairly dry isn't the right word, but lower than normal reservoir storages. So good news that a lot of these forecasts are for above normal volumes, and also that February to date has provided some more upticks in precipitation and snowpack. But yeah, pretty much uniformly above normal forecasts at that 50% chance of exceedance and some better. Some on the lower end, some of these along the North Fork of the Gunnison, as well as Surface Creek coming off the Grand Mesa, have some of the most plentiful values in the Gunnison. Things coming out of the northern San Juans on the Uncompahgre here, slightly lower than our main basin outlet, the Gunnison near Grand Junction, probably about 125% of normal, which we'll be able to see here, right on 125. But yeah, see a bit of the spatial trend here. Again, the Uncompahgre forecasts and the Lake Fork, some of the lower, Cochetopa Creek is the lowest. Pretty plentiful forecasts along the North Fork. Taylor Park at 130% of normal. So going down into our combined San Miguel, Dolores, Animas, and San Juan basins, a lot of the similar trends that we've seen in the Gunnison here, basin-wide, looking at 135% of normal snowpack. Some of the most plentiful, we're seeing kind of in the general region of Lizard Head Pass, whereas some of our sites along Highway 550 over Red Mountain Pass, Molas, Coal Bank, a bit lower, and then some of these sites further southwest in the basin faring a bit better, but overall very consistently well above normal snowpack. Looking temporally, definitely can see some of the more dramatic kind of boom and bust periods, but mostly in the boom category here. Again, starting just before the new year, really substantial increases going from quite a bit below normal snowpack to well above. We can see really big precipitation throughout January, and then also the largest increase, I believe, that we saw in the state from this most recent storm here in February. That has left the water year-to-date precip at 122% of normal. So going into reservoirs, again, reminder, these bar charts do not display all of the reservoirs that we include in our basin-wide summary, just kind of a snapshot of a few. But we can see on the lower end, McPhee here is probably around 70% of normal, a little less. Lemon and Vallecito, some of the other bigger ones, doing a bit better. Navajo Reservoir, a lot of that water isn't necessarily impacting Colorado, at least down in a downstream sense, but definitely a major player in kind of managing the challenging situation at Lake Powell, and how the reclamation has been utilizing other upstream reservoirs to help manage the greater basin there. Going on to our time series here, you can see here really that in the last 3 years, the impact of the lower stream flow volumes really has had a hard time recovering from those low stream flows over the last several years to bring that reservoir storage back up. So hopefully the trend continues from a water supply standpoint, and we will get some improved stream flows this year to help that. Going into the forecasts themselves, pretty much above normal across the board as far as our 50% chance of exceedance is concerned. Generally also our 70% chance of exceedance is above that 100% of normal line here. So still, time will tell. As I think we've seen, thinking 2019 to date, how much kind of the weather from here through June can impact the resulting stream flows that we see. Looking at the map, not surprisingly, a lot of these stream flow forecasts are mirroring what we saw in the snowpack, with how a lot of the snowpack up in the general region of Lizard Head Pass was some of the highest. These Dolores River stream flow forecasts are the highest in these combined basins. The Mancos is looking good. Another big one, the Animas at Durango, for 117% of normal. Been pretty encouraging so far, particularly, again, relative to the last couple of years. Over into the Rio Grande Basin. Here, along with its shared watershed boundary with Arkansas, we'll see a similar situation to what we saw in the South Platte, where our basin-wide snowpack and forecast numbers aren't necessarily going to be reflecting conditions everywhere, and you might want to be digging deeper more into your local conditions for the streams that are going to impact you. Much more plentiful snowpacks in the western side of the Rio Grande, up near the main stem headwaters there, whereas a lot of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains have accumulated substantially less snow than really most other parts of the state. Believe that some of these values that are higher down in the southern Sangres are as a result of some of the recent storms, which is encouraging to see there, but kind of from say Fort Garland or say Alamosa as a bigger town, up north towards Poncha Pass, definitely some lower snowpacks. Here, looking at the time series, again, we can see this notable increase just recently here in February, which has really helped boost a lot of things in the Rio Grande. But again, a lot of that being driven more on the San Juans half of the basin as opposed to the Sangre de Cristos. All of this has left our water year-to-date precipitation just slightly above normal at 103% of the median. Reservoir conditions definitely improved over the previous two basins that we've looked at. We'll just skip ahead here. get a bit of a better estimate. But yeah, basin wide, looking at definitely above median reservoir storage. Again, hasn't been quite as shaken up as our combined Southwest basins and the Gunnison from our last several years, but you also don't see many big increases from those snowmelt runoff periods. Going into the forecast themselves, naturally following a lot of our precipitation and snowpack trends, with a lot of these forecasts up closer to the headwaters, being generally pretty near normal, some above, some slightly below. And then going into some of the other parts of the basin, a little bit less plentiful, but still not terrible, particularly with respect to ones that are in the state of Colorado, or, you know, would affect very many residents of Colorado. Some of the ones that jump out are these Costilla Creek forecasts are the lowest that we do. I believe these points are actually barely into New Mexico. So not quite as much of an impact there, but certainly those snowpack values and Sangres are something to keep an eye on. Looking at the map, basin-wide, looking at 101% of normal stream flow volumes, but quite a bit of variability. You can see Saguache Creek up here, fairly low, Ute Creek, and then here's these Costilla Creeks down pretty far south. And I believe these do confluence in the state of Colorado, but you know, heading south pretty quickly. So on to our final major basin is the Arkansas. Also here, big take-home point is for, you know, folks who are looking at their local water resources. These basin-wide numbers for both snowpack as well as stream flow aren't necessarily going to reflect your local condition. With a much more plentiful snowpack up in the headwaters above Salida there, as compared to a lot of these snowpack values, as well as the resulting forecasts that are resulting flowing east out of the Sangre de Cristos. And then particularly looking at these southernmost SNOTEL sites, we can see a stark difference between the sites on the western side of these southern Sangres compared to the eastern side there. So again, all of this has left the Greater Basin at just 82% of normal snowpack, which is by a good bit the lowest in the state currently. This is, I believe, the only basin in the state where our water year to date precipitation is actually slightly higher than the current snowpack values at 92% of the median. Going into reservoir storage, again, it's kind of a lot of the stories of our statewide, at least looking at statewide reservoirs, is there's the Gunnison and the combined Southwest basins, pretty low, and then all the rest of the basins are sitting quite a bit better at much closer to normal values. Again, but folks can naturally kind of focus their attention on some of these individual reservoirs depending on their particular needs. Going on our time series back to 1990, recent years, very, very similar pattern to the Rio Grande. We see a big drop off after 2019, but not huge fluctuations since then, but also have not been able to really jump quite back up to that normal value. Stream flow forecasts here. Very similar to what we saw in the South Platte, in that a lot of these more northern stream flow forecast points are for more plentiful values, with the exception of Grape Creek here, which is actually west of the Sangres, not a huge surprise, or east of the Sangres, excuse me. But then a lot of these more southern basins, you can see a pretty dramatic shift kind of to the left in these plots, with the more southern tributaries forecasted to have quite low stream flow volumes. just looking at the map, again, you can kind of tell this kind of north to south shift here with Grape Creek. Main stem here, I'm looking 107% at Salida, 100% of normal forecasts at Pueblo. But again, here's a great example of where our basin-wide number doesn't necessarily reflect what you're going to see in your local condition. These are just for your general knowledge. These basin-wide numbers are based volumetrically. So they are going to be much more heavily weighted towards these main stem Arkansas points as opposed to some of these lower volume rivers and streams down to the south. So zooming out to kind of see how things are distributed spatially, can certainly see here, again, the Arkansas is quite the outlier at just 82% of normal snowpack. Not sure if I mentioned at the beginning, again, these numbers are from last Friday with the holiday yesterday, so a bit outdated, but are still going to paint the picture pretty well. Then the Gunnison, most plentiful, along with northwest and southwest Colorado basins there, and others kind of right in the middle, closer to normal. Yeah, again, statewide, 121% of normal, but per usual, with Colorado being a headwaters state, most folks are going to be probably primarily interested in their local basin and conditions there. Water year-to-date precip, certainly a lot more tightly clustered than what we're seeing with snowpack. You can see the Arkansas was a bit higher. Some of these other western slope basins a bit lower values than their current snowpack. But also you can just see this pretty clear continental divide line here with things generally flowing west out of the state, having more substantial precipitation. Here's an interesting one, taking a look at our month to date. Some pretty stark differences there. Forget the exact terminology that Peter used, but yeah, basically a continuation of a lot of the basins here in Southwest Colorado that have been faring well, continued to do so. Not necessarily the case for the Yampa White and Little Snake, but fortunately they had a pretty robust snowpack going into February. But generally, take-home point here for here is how much of really the southwest quadrant of the state of Colorado has received the most plentiful February for precipitation. That has left water year-to-date precip as a whole, again, 112% of normal there. Going into reservoir storage, feel like I've hit this pretty well, but the map certainly paints the picture very nicely of kind of what I was saying is we've got the Gunnison and our combined southwest basins sitting substantially lower than really any other major basin in the state with respect to stream flow forecast. And again, that is largely kind of an indicator of the hydrologic conditions over the last couple years as well. So here we've got a kind of going back to our time series of the volumetric deficits or surpluses across the state. This prominent brown line is the summation of all state of Colorado reservoir storage. And you can really see where this is being driven volumetrically, with the green being the Gunnison and this bluish color being our combined southwest basins. Also note with that is even with Blue Mesa being rather low and our biggest reservoir in the state, that these combined southwest basins do have even a larger total volumetric deficit than the Gunnison. Going into our stream flow forecasts, again, these are from February 1st. So as we saw in that month to date precip chart, I would imagine some of these western slope basins are going to come a little closer together with respect to their forecasts coming March 1st, since some of these northern basins didn't receive very much precipitation in the mountains. Some of the southwest basins did. But yeah, also just generally with Forecasts on the east of the Continental Divide, again, with the exception of the Laramie and North Platte, are going to head that way, being near normal, and then much more plentiful in the western slope basins. So yeah, just on to wrap things up. All major basins currently holding above normal snowpack, with the exception of the Arkansas. Definitely a good year, really, as every year. In addition to our major basin summaries statistics, take a look at your local conditions. As I really tried to point out, a lot of the stuff on the upper main stem South Platte is looking at lower snowpacks and forecasts than other portions of the basin, as well as in the Arkansas and Rio Grande. February to date precipitation was substantially lower statewide than January was, but that definitely largely favored southern Colorado, and most particularly southwest Colorado, where northern and northwest Colorado received quite a bit less. February 1st stream flow forecasts on a basin scale range from slightly below normal to well above, but with some of those regional differences, many individual forecasts are still for quite a bit below normal volumes. Reservoir storage, highly variable. Again, kind of there's the Gunnison and Southwest basins at 67% of normal reservoir storage. And then there's kind of the rest of the state, at least doing a bit better, but really with no major basins holding quite a bit above normal storages. And then going back to that metric, looking at percent current snowpack relative to the median peak value. Statewide, we are currently at 82% of that median peak value, with about a month and a half left in what is usually our primary snowpack accumulation season. But also, as we've observed over the last 4 or 5 or more years, or you can go back as far as you want, that, like first, second week in April, as the peak snowpack isn't necessarily always the case. Last year in Southwest Colorado, we saw a really rapid snowmelt quite a bit earlier than normal. Other years that peak may be well into May. So as we get closer and closer to the runoff season, certainly something to just keep a close eye on as things change. That is all I had for now. If there are any questions.
Thanks, Carl. I'm not hearing any questions. So I'm happy to move on to water provider updates, but we do have a pretty small turnout today. So I realize it'll be a little bit limited, but Swithin or others, feel free to jump on and provide any updates from water providers. I'm not seeing any of the representatives from the impact task forces on right now.
So this is Swithin with Highlands Ranch, Centennial Water. A little bit past midwinter. I'm liking what we're seeing so far, and I agree with Peter's relaying the comments from the ranchers that, yeah, this is looking like a winter like we used to have, say, in the 70s and 80s for us old timers. Not calling you out, John, not at all. Storage for us is looking pretty good because our water treatment plant has been down since 1st of November for rehab and construction. So we're just putting water into our reservoirs, relying on our groundwater wells. So we have brought it up from really dismal conditions to about 54% of capacity. And I'm optimistic, not confident we're going to finish out the year with above average snowpack, but I'm hopeful that we will. So we still have March and April to go. So those can be some pretty good snow producers for us. We'll see what goes, but overall, no concerns at this time for Centennial.
Thanks. Any others that would care to chime in?
This is Katie Garrett with Colorado Springs Utilities. I don't really have a lot to report. We're currently sitting at about 71.4% of reservoir storage, and that's a few percentage points higher than our normal for this time of year. Average demands for this time of year as well. So I think that's about it from our perspective. Nothing really unusual going on.
Thanks for chiming in. All right, not hearing any other updates, but I'll give it one more minute. Okay, well, if there are no other updates, I think we can probably wrap up today's meeting. Our next meeting is planned for March 28th, and we'll be sending out an agenda ahead of time. Happy to take a pause for any questions, and thank you today. All right, well, hearing no questions, we'll wrap up the meeting for today. Thanks for jumping on, everyone.
Thanks, Kat.
Thanks.